The hum of the engines was a low, steady rhythm as the passengers of Flight 308 settled into their seats. It was the kind of evening flight that promised quiet skies, dim cabin lights, and a chance to unwind before reaching their destinations. Among the travelers was none other than Michael Jordan, the basketball legend whose name alone could fill stadiums with cheering fans. Dressed in an understated hoodie and sleek sneakers, he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had faced every challenge and conquered them all. Yet tonight he was just another passenger, seeking a moment of peace before the busy days ahead. First class wasn't just a perk for Michael, it was a necessity. Long flights required space for his tall frame, and he valued the privacy it afforded him. As he made his way to his seat, heads turned, whispers rippled through the cabin, and a few bold passengers sneaked photos on their phones. Michael offered polite nods and brief smiles, used to the quiet awe his presence inspired. The flight attendant assigned to first class, a young woman named Claire, glanced at the boarding pass Michael handed her. Her eyes darted up, and for a moment there was something unreadable in her expression. A flicker of recognition, perhaps mixed with something else. "Right this way, Mr. Jordan," she said, her tone professional but cool. Michael took his seat near the window, slipping his carry-on into the overhead bin with ease. The first-class cabin was filling up, a mix of business travelers and a few families treating themselves to a luxury experience. Across the aisle, a little girl no older than 8 clutched her stuffed bear, her eyes wide as she whispered to her mother, "Mom, is that Michael Jordan?" Her mother smiled and nodded, but urged her to keep her voice down. As the cabin doors closed and the flight prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere seemed routine. The seatbelt signs blinked on, the safety demonstration began, and passengers settled in for what was expected to be an uneventful trip. Michael leaned back, adjusting his noise-cancelling headphones, ready to immerse himself in a playlist that would drown out the world. But uneventful was not in the cards that night. The first sign of tension came barely an hour into the flight. Michael had requested a glass of water, his voice calm and polite as he pressed the service button. Claire arrived moments later, her demeanor noticeably stiff. She handed him the glass with a tight-lipped smile, not meeting his eyes. "Here you go," she said curtly before turning on her heel and walking away. Michael furrowed his brow, but said nothing. He had encountered all sorts of reactions in his life: adoration, envy, even disdain. It wasn't worth overthinking. But as the hours passed, Claire's behavior became harder to ignore. She seemed to linger near his seat, her eyes occasionally narrowing as though she was waiting for him to do something. Anything that might justify her unease. At one point, when Michael stood to stretch his legs, Claire intercepted him. "Sir," she said, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I need to ask that you remain seated unless it's absolutely necessary." Michael blinked, surprised by her tone. "I was just stretching," he replied, his voice measured. "We have policies," she added briskly, stepping aside but not before casting a glance at a fellow flight attendant, who looked equally puzzled by her demeanor. Passengers nearby exchanged looks, sensing the tension. The little girl across the aisle whispered to her mother again, this time asking, "Why is she being mean to him?" Her mother hushed her, but the question hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Things escalated during the meal service. Claire approached Michael's seat with a tray of food and, without warning, set it down with a bit more force than necessary. The plate rattled, and a few drops of sauce splattered onto the tray table. Michael, ever the composed professional, didn't react beyond a quiet thank you. But it was clear to everyone around that something wasn't right. The final straw came when Michael asked to switch seats with another passenger. A frequent request for someone of his stature, especially when extra legroom was needed. He had politely approached a flight attendant, explaining the situation, and the passenger in question had been more than willing to accommodate. But when Claire overheard, she intervened. "That won't be possible," she said firmly, stepping between Michael and the other passenger. Michael frowned. "Why not? They've agreed, and it's no inconvenience to anyone." Claire's gaze hardened. "It's against protocol," she said, though no such rule existed. The exchange drew the attention of nearly everyone in first class. Whispers swirled as passengers craned their necks, wondering why Claire seemed intent on making an issue where there wasn't one. Michael, who had spent decades in the public eye, was used to scrutiny, but this felt different. There was no crowd to win over, no game to play. This was a quiet battle of wills, and he wasn't sure why it was happening. And then the unthinkable happened. Claire, her voice louder now and tinged with authority, announced, "Sir, if you cannot comply with our instructions, I will have to ask you to leave the first-class cabin." The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Passengers gasped, their disbelief palpable. Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Excuse me," he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. "You heard me," Claire replied, her words clipped. "Please gather your belongings and follow me." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on Michael, who remained seated for a moment, processing what had just been said. Was this really happening? Across the aisle, the little girl stared wide-eyed, clutching her bear tighter. Her mother whispered something to her, but she didn't look away. Michael finally stood, his movements deliberate. He grabbed his carry-on bag and followed Claire down the aisle, the murmurs of passengers trailing behind him. In that moment, he wasn't the Michael Jordan, the 6-time NBA champion, the global icon. He was just a man, stripped of his dignity, walking a path that felt all too familiar to anyone who had ever been unfairly singled out. As he reached the back of the plane, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. What was supposed to be a quiet flight had turned into a spectacle, and everyone was left wondering the same thing: what happens next? What unfolded over the next few hours would leave every passenger on that plane stunned, and remind the world why Michael Jordan's legacy was about more than basketball. Michael Jordan followed Claire down the aisle, his footsteps measured, his face unreadable. The murmurs behind him grew louder as passengers exchanged confused, uneasy glances. Some took out their phones, snapping photos or recording discreetly, their curiosity outweighing their reservations about intruding. Others simply sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of the bizarre scene unfolding before them. As Michael moved into the economy cabin, he felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. The cozy luxury of first class gave way to the cramped reality of coach, where passengers jostled for overhead bin space and parents struggled to keep restless children entertained. Heads turned as Michael passed, and whispers followed him like a shadow. Even those who hadn't recognized him earlier were now clued in by the collective buzz. He was led to an empty aisle seat near the back, far from the quiet and privacy of his original spot. Claire gestured for him to sit, her expression blank, almost mechanical, as if she were following a script. Michael looked at her for a moment, his eyes searching hers, but there was no trace of explanation or apology. He sat down, placing his bag beneath the seat in front of him with deliberate care. The passenger beside him, a man in his mid-30s with glasses and a laptop balanced on his knees, blinked in disbelief. "Are you?" he began, his voice low. Michael offered a small nod, cutting him off before the man could finish. He wasn't in the mood for pleasantries or recognition. He leaned back in his seat, staring straight ahead, trying to piece together what had just happened. Claire disappeared down the aisle, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered hostility or unfair treatment. He'd spent his life navigating a world that often judged him by the color of his skin before acknowledging his achievements. But this felt different. It wasn't just the actions of one person. It was the silence of everyone around him that stunned the most. Back in first class, the little girl who had watched the entire scene unfold turned to her mother, her brow furrowed. "Why did he have to leave?" she asked. Her mother hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said softly. "Sometimes people make mistakes." "But it wasn't his fault," the girl insisted, her voice rising slightly. "He didn't do anything wrong." Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, urging her to quiet down, but the girl's words lingered in the air. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had seen everything and had even considered speaking up, but the thought of confrontation, of drawing attention to himself, had kept him silent. Now he'd found himself regretting it. As the flight continued, the tension only grew. The passengers in first class whispered among themselves, some exchanging uneasy glances with the flight attendants, who now seemed flustered and unsure. The co-pilot made his way through the cabin at one point, his expression calm but serious, as though he was investigating the situation. Meanwhile, back in coach, Michael sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees. The man beside him kept stealing glances, clearly torn between wanting to ask questions and respecting Michael's obvious desire for space. Finally, he couldn't help himself. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't mean to intrude, but that was strange. Why did they move you?" Michael turned his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze. For a moment, he considered brushing off the question, but something in the man's tone, genuine curiosity, perhaps even concern, made him pause. "I wish I knew," Michael said simply. The man nodded, sensing there was more to the story, but knowing better than to press further. "Well," he added after a moment, "for what it's worth, I think it's ridiculous. You didn't deserve that." Michael offered a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks," he said. The hours dragged on, and the unease in the cabin was palpable. The little girl's words, the passengers' murmurs, and the lingering sense of injustice all hung heavy in the air. Even the flight attendants seemed on edge, their usual polished smiles replaced with hurried movements and hushed conversations. As the plane began its descent, Michael's thoughts turned to what lay ahead. He had a meeting scheduled the next morning, a high-profile event, where he was expected to speak about leadership and resilience. The irony wasn't lost on him. How could he stand in front of a crowd and talk about overcoming challenges when he had just endured such blatant disrespect? When the plane finally touched down, the usual rustling of passengers gathering their belongings was accompanied by an undercurrent of tension. As Michael stood to retrieve his bag, a few passengers in the economy section murmured words of encouragement, their voices quiet but sincere. "Big fan," one man said, giving Michael a thumbs up. "Keep your head up," another added. Michael nodded in acknowledgement, grateful for the support, but still grappling with the weight of the experience. As he exited the plane, he noticed Claire standing by the door, her posture stiff. She avoided his gaze as he passed, but Michael didn't say a word. He simply walked on, his steps steady, his expression unreadable. The airport was bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the confined world of the airplane. Michael made his way to the baggage claim, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't let the incident slide, but he also knew that how he responded would matter. This wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. As he waited for his luggage, a tap on his shoulder startled him. He turned to see the little girl from first class, her mother standing a few steps behind her. The girl held out a piece of paper, a drawing she had made during the flight. It was a simple sketch of an airplane, with a small figure standing at the front, arms raised triumphantly. "This is for you," she said, her voice shy but steady. "You're my hero." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat as he took the drawing, his fingers brushing against the crinkled edges of the paper. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The girl beamed, and her mother gave Michael an apologetic smile. "She insisted," she said softly. "And for what it's worth, we're sorry for what happened. It wasn't right." Michael nodded, grateful for their kindness. "It means a lot," he said. As he left the airport, the drawing tucked carefully into his bag, Michael knew that this was only the beginning. The events of the flight had shaken him, but they had also ignited something within him, a determination to address the injustices he had faced and to use his voice to inspire change. What had started as a routine flight had become a turning point, a moment that would challenge him to rise above the silence and make his stand. And while he didn't know exactly what would come next, he was certain of one thing. This fight wasn't over. Michael sat in the back seat of a black SUV, the city's evening glow filtering through the tinted windows. The driver navigated through traffic with practiced ease, but Michael barely noticed the stops and starts. His mind was consumed by the events of the day, each moment replaying like a relentless highlight reel. He stared at the folded drawing in his lap, the little girl's heartfelt gift. Despite its simplicity, it was the most profound gesture he had encountered all day, a reminder that even in moments of unfairness, there were flickers of humanity. His phone buzzed incessantly, the screen lighting up with messages from friends, colleagues, and reporters. News of the incident had spread faster than he expected, likely fueled by passengers who had witnessed the altercation. Social media was already ablaze with speculation and commentary. Michael had avoided reading the messages, but the weight of public attention was impossible to ignore. He knew that every move he made from this point forward would be scrutinized, debated, and dissected. The SUV pulled up to his hotel, a sleek, towering building that seemed almost intimidating in its grandeur. The driver opened the door, and Michael stepped out, greeted by a gust of cool air. A few photographers lingered near the entrance, their cameras flashing as they captured his arrival. He kept his head down, offering no comment, and walked swiftly through the lobby. In the solitude of his room, Michael finally allowed himself to breathe. The silence was almost deafening, but it gave him space to think. He poured himself a glass of water and sat by the window, gazing at the sprawling city below. The lights twinkled like stars, a stark contrast to the turbulence he felt inside. The little girl's voice echoed in his mind, her innocent words. "You're my hero," carrying both comfort and weight. As the night wore on, Michael found himself scrolling through his phone, his curiosity finally outweighing his reluctance. Clips from the flight were already circulating online, along with passenger accounts of what had transpired. Most of the comments were supportive, condemning the flight attendant's actions and praising Michael's composure. Yet there were others, voices that questioned his reaction, downplayed the incident, or, worse, defended the actions of those who had wronged him. One video caught his attention, a grainy recording taken from the aisle of the plane. It captured the moment Claire had confronted him, her tone curt, her posture rigid. The camera had also panned to the faces of the other passengers, some shocked, others indifferent, a few quietly amused. It was those expressions, or lack thereof, that stung the most. Their silence had spoken volumes, reinforcing the very prejudice Michael had spent his life fighting against. The next morning, Michael woke early, the sun barely cresting the horizon. He dressed in a sharp but understated suit, his mind already racing with thoughts about the day ahead. His assistant had arranged a meeting with his public relations team to discuss the incident and how best to address it. Michael knew the stakes were high. His response needed to be thoughtful, measured, and impactful. As he entered the conference room, the air was charged with tension. His team greeted him with a mix of concern and determination, their laptops open, notebooks filled with scribbled ideas. They had already prepared a draft statement, but Michael wanted to speak from the heart. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady but firm. "What happened on that flight? It's something people face every day. It's not just about being treated unfairly. It's about the silence, the complicity. That's what hurts the most, and that's what we need to address." His team nodded, taking notes as he spoke. They discussed potential angles, from highlighting the broader issue of systemic bias to focusing on the importance of allyship and speaking up against injustice. Michael was adamant about one thing: the message had to inspire change. He didn't want to frame himself as a victim, but as a catalyst for a larger conversation. Meanwhile, the airline had released a carefully worded statement expressing regret for the misunderstanding and promising an internal review. Michael read it with a mixture of frustration and resolve. The words felt hollow, more concerned with damage control than genuine accountability. He knew this was only the beginning of the battle. As the day unfolded, Michael's story continued to gain traction. News outlets picked it up, framing it as a clash between celebrity and prejudice. Activists weighed in, using the incident as a rallying cry for broader social change. Even some of Michael's peers in the sports and entertainment world began to speak out, their voices adding weight to the growing movement. Amid the whirlwind of attention, Michael found himself reflecting on his journey. He thought about his early days when every game was a proving ground and every interaction was a reminder that he was often seen as an outsider. He remembered the taunts from opponents, the doubters who questioned his abilities, and the moments when he had to fight just to be seen as equal. Those experiences had shaped him, fueling his drive to excel and his commitment to paving the way for others. But this moment felt different. It wasn't about his skills or achievements, it was about his humanity. And that, he realized, was a battle he couldn't fight alone. That evening, Michael attended the event he had been scheduled for, a leadership summit featuring prominent figures from various industries. As he stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause, their admiration for him undiminished by the controversy. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, and took a deep breath. "Before I begin," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "I want to share something that happened to me yesterday. Not because I want sympathy, but because it's a story that needs to be told." For the next few minutes, he recounted the events of the flight, his words raw and unfiltered. He spoke about the little girl who had seen him for who he was, the passengers who had chosen silence, and the overwhelming sense of isolation he had felt. "But this isn't just my story," he continued. "This is the story of so many people who face prejudice and discrimination every day. People who don't have the platform or the resources to speak out. And it's a reminder that we all have a choice, to stay silent or to stand up for what's right." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience. Michael's speech wasn't just a recounting of events, it was a call to action, a challenge to each person in the room to reflect on their own choices and behaviors. As the applause erupted once again, Michael felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready to face it head-on. For the first time since the flight, he felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that guided his steps forward. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. This was a moment that would define not just his career, but his legacy. After the event, Michael returned to his hotel, the energy from the summit still pulsing through him. His speech had resonated, sparking conversations among attendees and online. Social media was now a whirlwind of discussions, with hashtags related to his story trending worldwide. Messages poured in from people sharing their own experiences of bias, thanking him for speaking out. Despite the flood of positivity, Michael couldn't shake a lingering unease. The airline's statement continued to nag at him. It felt like an attempt to sweep the issue under the rug without addressing the deeper problem. He sat by the window, staring at the city lights. His mind drifted to the man in the suit who had instigated the incident. Michael could still see the man's smug expression. He had a dismissive tone in his voice. What bothered him wasn't just the man's words, but the way everyone else had looked away, their silence complicit. It wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It was about the system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Michael's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his assistant, who had been coordinating with his legal and PR teams throughout the day. "The airline reached out," she said, her voice cautious. "They want to arrange a private meeting to apologize directly. No media, no press release, just behind closed doors." Michael's jaw tightened. A private apology wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't address the systemic issues that had been laid bare on that flight. "Tell them I'm not interested in a quiet resolution," he replied. "If they want to apologize, they can do it publicly. This isn't just about me. It's about accountability." As he hung up, a new thought took hold. The passengers. What if someone had recorded more of what had happened? If the airline wasn't willing to confront the truth, perhaps the voices of the witnesses could help shed light on what really occurred. Michael reached out to his team, asking them to track down passengers who might be willing to share their accounts. The next morning, Michael was greeted by a new wave of headlines. A passenger's video had surfaced online, showing a fuller picture of the incident. In the clip, Claire could be heard making the initial remarks that had set the tone for the entire confrontation. The video also captured Michael's calm demeanor as he tried to defuse the situation, juxtaposed against the flight attendant's sharp, dismissive tone. The video sparked outrage. People flooded the airline's social media accounts with demands for accountability. Advocacy groups issued statements calling for better training for airline staff and stricter policies against discriminatory behavior. The momentum was growing, and Michael knew he needed to channel it into meaningful action. As the day wore on, Michael's team managed to connect with several passengers from the flight. Most were reluctant to speak publicly, citing concerns about backlash or legal ramifications. But one voice stood out, a middle-aged woman named Linda, who had been seated a few rows behind Michael. "I saw the whole thing," she said during their phone call. "I should have said something then, but I didn't, and I've regretted it ever since. If there's anything I can do to help now, I will." Michael felt a mix of gratitude and relief. Linda's willingness to speak out was a small but significant step. With her permission, his team arranged for her to share her account with a major news outlet, ensuring that her voice would be heard. Meanwhile, the airline was scrambling to control the narrative. They announced that Claire had been placed on leave pending an investigation, and that they would be implementing new sensitivity training for their staff. But the public wasn't satisfied. The calls for systemic change grew louder, and the spotlight remained firmly on the airline's practices. That evening, Michael sat down for an interview with a prominent journalist. It was his first public appearance since the incident, and he knew the stakes were high. The room was quiet as the cameras rolled, the journalist's piercing gaze fixed on him. "Michael," she began, "you've been in the public eye for decades. You'd faced challenges on and off the court. How does this moment compare?" Michael took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "This moment feels different," he said. "On the court, challenges are clear. You know the rules, and you know what it takes to win. But in life, the rules aren't always fair, and the challenges aren't always obvious. What happened on that flight? It wasn't just about one person's prejudice. It was about the silence, the complicity, the systems that allow this kind of behavior to persist. And that's what we need to address." The journalist leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think this incident will lead to real change?" "I hope so," Michael replied. "But change doesn't happen on its own. It takes effort, it takes accountability, and it takes people willing to speak out, even when it's uncomfortable. That's why I'm here, and that's why I'll keep fighting." The interview aired later that night, drawing widespread attention. Michael's words struck a chord, resonating with viewers across the globe. The incident had become more than just a headline. It was a catalyst for a larger conversation about equality, respect, and the power of standing up against injustice. As the days passed, the tension continued to build. The airline faced mounting pressure to take more decisive action, while advocacy groups and public figures rallied behind Michael's message. Despite the progress, Michael knew the fight was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and obstacles. But he also knew he wasn't alone. The little girl's drawing still sat on his desk, a constant reminder of the kindness and courage that had shone through the darkness. It was a small but powerful symbol of hope, a reminder that even in moments of struggle, there was always a way forward. And as Michael prepared for the next steps in his journey, he carried that hope with him, ready to face whatever came next.